There's a white envelope on my kitchen table. My son's handwriting. My name is Loretta. I'm 68 years old, a retired ICU nurse, and I've been staring at that envelope for 10 minutes now. The coffee's getting cold. I know what's inside will change something. I just don't know yet if I'm ready for it to. But before I open it, I need to tell you how we got here. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments. And please, stay with me until the end. Before I get into all of it, I want to tell you what kind of person I am, because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I spent 35 years as an ICU nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Burlington, Vermont. Not the kind of nurse who hands out Jell-O and checks in every few hours. I worked the intensive care unit, specifically in end-of-life care, which means my job, day after day, year after year, was to sit with people who were dying and help them leave this world without fear. You learn things in that work that you can't unlearn. You learn that people don't actually fear death the way most folks think they do. What they fear is being alone in it. What they fear is that no one will be there when it happens. I have held the hands of strangers at 3 a.m. in rooms that smelled like antiseptic and old flowers, and I have watched the moment when a person stops being afraid because someone finally showed up and stayed. That was my job. I was good at it. I was also good at reading people. 35 years of watching faces tell you things their mouths won't. The slight tightening around the eyes. The way someone's shoulders drop when they've finally decided something they haven't said out loud yet. The difference between someone who's asking a question and someone who's already made up their mind and just wants you to agree. I never switched that off, even now. Especially now. My husband Warren died in 2009. Pancreatic cancer. He was 54 years old, and he went fast, which he said was a mercy, and I understood what they meant, even as I hated hearing it. Our son Colt was 14. There was no one else. No siblings on my side, no parents still living. Just me and a teenage boy who looked exactly like his father and didn't know what to do with his hands at the funeral. I didn't collapse. I didn't have time to collapse. I went back to work after 3 days because bills don't pause for grief, and Colt needed lunch money, and the mortgage wasn't going to pay itself. I made a schedule. I kept it. Colt's grief sat next to mine at the dinner table every night, and we just kept passing each other this little salt and getting through it the only way we knew how, which was one day at a time without making a big production out of it. People used to tell me I was strong. I never knew what to say to that. It wasn't strength. It was just the only option available. I took on extra shifts. I put a little money aside every month, not much at first, but it added up over the years in the way that small, consistent things do when you don't touch them. I didn't dream about cruises or resort vacations. I dreamed about a place where nobody needed anything from me, just space, just quiet, just enough room to finally hear my own thoughts without a buzzer going off somewhere nearby. When Colt got his first apartment at 22, I covered the deposit. When he and Petra got engaged, I paid for her wedding dress after her mother declined to. Nobody asked me to do either of those things. I just did them because that's who I was. They always said thank you, kindly, politely, the way you thank someone for holding a door open. I never asked for anything back. I didn't want a grandchild named after me or birthday brunches in my honor. I just wanted, when the time came, to be left in peace. That's all I ever wanted. I retired in June of 2022. 35 years, and I walked out of Mercy General on a Tuesday afternoon with a card signed by the staff and a gift basket that included, I kid you not, a scented candle shaped like a stethoscope. I drove home, set the basket on the kitchen counter, and stood in the middle of my apartment in Burlington and thought, okay, now what? 3 months later, I found the listing. Farmhouse, 1890s. 4 bedrooms, 3 acres of land outside Woodstock, Vermont, about an hour southeast of Burlington, 8 minutes from the town center. The photos showed a roof that leaked in one corner, original plumbing that the listing politely described as having character, and hardwood floors in the hallway that had warped enough to look like a gentle wave rolling toward the front door. The price was low because nobody wanted to deal with it. I did. I bought it with a cashier's check, paid in full. The money I'd been setting aside for decades. The vacations I hadn't taken, the things I hadn't bought, the overtime shifts that had felt pointless at the time, but had quietly accumulated into something real. I remember sitting in Declan Price's office, my real estate attorney in Burlington, signing the paperwork and thinking this is it. This is what all of that was for. First time I turned the key and walked in alone, the floors creaked under my feet, and the air smelled like old wood and something faintly sweet I couldn't place. Light came straight through the kitchen windows and hit the sink, and for a second I just stood there with my hand on the door frame. Then I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. I want to be clear that when I say I moved in, I mean I moved into a house that was still very much a work in progress. I had the basics running by late 2023, enough to live comfortably, but the renovation continued well into early 2024. I mention this because it matters later. 18 months in total. That's how long it took me to make that house fully what I wanted it to be. I taught myself to fix pipes from YouTube videos, rewatching the same tutorials 4 and 5 times, pausing to take notes, getting it wrong twice before I got it right. I repainted the kitchen walls 3 times because the first color was too yellow and the second was somehow both too gray and not gray enough. I replaced the warped hardwood in the hallway myself, which took 6 weeks and left my knees aching every morning for a month afterward. I hired out the roof and the electrical because there are limits to what a 67-year-old woman should attempt alone, and I know where mine are. My knees complained about the floor work every single morning after I ignored them. By March of 2024, the house was finished, not perfect. The third bedroom still had wallpaper from what I could only assume was the 1970s, a pattern of orange and brown flowers that I decided, somewhere around month 12, that I had a grudging respect for. The back porch had a loose board I kept meaning to fix. The kitchen faucet ran a little cold even when you asked for hot, but it was mine. The first morning I woke up there after everything was done, I made coffee and sat on the front steps and listened to nothing. No hospital sounds, no buzzers, no code calls down the hallway. No one in the next room who needed something from me before I'd finished my first cup. Just the wind in the trees and a bird I couldn't identify, and the smell of something green coming up through the thawed ground. I sat there for a long time. I cried a little, which surprised me, because I am not generally a crier. But it wasn't sad crying. It was more like the kind of thing that happens when you've been holding your breath for a very long time and you finally just let it out. Now let me tell you about Colt. He's 33 years old, works in software engineering out of Boston, and he is, in most respects, a genuinely good person. He calls on birthdays. He remembers things I've mentioned in passing and asks about them later. He has his father's way of tilting his head slightly to one side when he's thinking something through, and sometimes I look at him and it still catches me a little off guard. He visited the farmhouse for the first time in April of 2023, about 6 months after I bought it. Came up alone for a long weekend. We painted the back fence together, and I burned the grilled chicken because we were talking too much and neither of us noticed until the smoke got bad. He helped me move the heavy bookshelf in the living room to the spot where I'd wanted it since day one. We watched old movies and he fell asleep on the couch before the second one was halfway through. It was a good visit, one of the better ones we'd had in years, honestly. I want to be clear about that. Things weren't broken between us before all of this. He was my son and I loved him and we were fine. And then there's Petra. I met her properly for the first time at their wedding in 2019, though I'd seen her a handful of times before that at family gatherings where she always had the right thing to say and remembered everyone's names and had the specific kind of social ease that you either find charming or slightly exhausting, depending on your mood. She was smart. She was organized. She worked in marketing and was apparently quite good at it. But here's the thing about being a nurse for 35 years. You spend that much time reading people in high-stakes situations, you start to notice things in low-stakes ones too. Little things. The way someone's smile stays a half second too long after the thing that prompted it. The way their eyes move when they're in a new room, cataloging exits and opportunities before they catalog the people. Petra was always watching before she spoke. not to listen, to calculate. I never said that to anyone. Not to Colt, not to a friend, not out loud to myself. I just filed it away the way I filed everything, quietly and in order. I should have known that sooner or later I'd need to refer back to it. It didn't start with a moving truck. It started with an envelope. January 2024. I was at the kitchen table with my morning coffee when the mail came, which out here in Woodstock means the carrier pulls up the gravel drive and leaves everything in the box at the end of the road. I walked down in my boots, the kind of cold that gets into your ears even with a hat on, and came back with a small stack of the usual things. Electric bill, a catalog I didn't remember subscribing to, and a letter from the Vermont Department of Motor Vehicles addressed to someone named Rudolph Holt. My address, someone else's name. I read it twice standing right there in the kitchen doorway with my coat still on. Then I set it on the table and read it a third time. Then I went and got my coffee and sat down and looked at it for a while without touching it. A week later, a second envelope arrived. This one from the IRS. Same address, different name. Winifred Holt. I called Declan Price that same morning. Declan had handled my property purchase, and he was the kind of attorney who picked up his own phone, which I appreciated. I explained what I had in front of me. He was quiet for a moment, and then he explained something to me that I hadn't known before that call. In Vermont, he said, to register someone else's address as your own with the state agency, you typically need what's called a residency affidavit. It's a signed document from the property owner confirming that the person in question has permission to use that address as their legal residence. Without it, the registration shouldn't go through. Someone had submitted an affidavit for both Rudolph and Winifred Holt, he told me, signed by the property owner, signed allegedly by me. I had not signed anything. I sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was warm. The faucet dripped slightly on the cold side the way it always did. Outside the window, the fields were white and flat and perfectly still. Someone had forged my signature on a legal document in the state of Vermont. I called Colt. He picked up on the second ring. Hey, Mom, same as always, warm and easy. I told him what I had found. I told him what Declan had explained. I asked him directly whether he knew anything about this. 4 seconds of silence. I counted them. Old habit. In the ICU, you learn that silence has weight, that the length of a pause tells you almost as much as the words that eventually follow it. Then he said that Petra had mentioned something about her parents needing a temporary address. He said he hadn't known she'd already gone ahead and done it. I told him that done it was one thing, that forging my name on a legal affidavit was something else entirely. Another silence, shorter this time. Then he said, Mom, I really didn't know she'd gone that far. I believed him. That was the part that made it worse, honestly. I believed him completely. I didn't call Colt back after that. I called Petra. She picked up after 2 rings. Her voice was measured and pleasant, the same voice she used at family dinners when she was about to steer the conversation somewhere she'd already decided it needed to go. She said, Mrs. Vance, I figured you'd be calling. I didn't respond to that. I just asked her directly who had signed the affidavit. She paused. Then she launched into an explanation. Smooth, organized, clearly rehearsed. Her parents' house in Connecticut had been sold as part of a property dispute with a relative. It was messy and complicated, and she didn't want to get into all of it. They needed a valid address to maintain their driver's licenses and their Medicare coverage. Without an address on file, they could lose access to benefits they'd been paying into for decades. She'd only meant to help them, and she'd been so sure I wouldn't mind that she hadn't wanted to bother me with the details. I let her finish. Then I said, You were so sure I wouldn't mind that you didn't ask me, and when not asking wasn't enough, you signed my name on a legal document. She said, Mrs. Vance, it's just paperwork. I said, It's forgery, Petra. That's what it's called in Vermont and everywhere else. The line went quiet, not the warm silence of someone thinking, the cool silence of someone recalibrating. Then her tone shifted, just a degree or two. She said she understood I was upset, but the practical reality was that her parents were in a difficult situation through no fault of their own, and she'd only done what she felt she had to do. She said it calmly, reasonably, like she was explaining something to someone who just hadn't thought it through properly yet. I told her that Declan would be in contact to have everything reversed, and that I needed it done by the end of the week. She said, "Fine, Mrs. Vance." But the way she said it wasn't fine at all. I'd worked alongside enough people in high-pressure situations to know the difference between someone who's backing down and someone who's just changing tactics. Petra wasn't backing down. She was regrouping. Colt called me back that evening. I could tell from the first word that he'd spent the hours between our morning call trying to figure out how to have this conversation, which meant he hadn't figured it out. He told me that the situation with Petra's family was genuinely hard. Her dad, Rudolph, had lost his job 6 months earlier and had a heart condition that made finding new work difficult. Her mom, Winifred, had been dealing with some health issues, too. Nothing critical, but enough to be a real concern. And Svirsi, Petra's younger sister, was 28, single, raising 2 little kids on her own, and struggling to keep up with rent in a market that had gotten brutal over the past few years. I asked him how long he'd known all of this. He said a few months. I said, "And you didn't tell me?" He said he hadn't wanted me to worry. I looked out the kitchen window at the dark fields. The outdoor light at the edge of the property cast a small yellow circle on the snow. Beyond it, nothing but black and the sound of wind moving through the trees. I said, "Colt, you didn't want me to worry, or you didn't want to have to choose." He didn't answer right away. When he did, he said, "Mom, if they just stayed for a few weeks, just until things got sorted out, would it really be so bad?" I said, "No, just no. Not I need to think about it. Not let's talk about this more. Just no." He said, "Mom, come on." I said, "This is my home, Colt. Not a halfway house, not a solution to a problem I didn't create. No." The line was quiet. Then I hung up. For only the second time in my life, I hung up the phone while I was still talking to my son. The first time had been that morning. I sat at the table for a long time after that. The coffee had gone cold. I didn't bother heating it up. 2 weeks passed, early February. The affidavit reversal was in process, and I let myself think, maybe that was the end of it. Maybe the conversation had landed somewhere useful. Maybe things would quietly settle the way things sometimes do when everyone involved decides, without saying so out loud, that the fight isn't worth the cost. Then Ruth Alden knocked on my door. Ruth is 72 and has lived on the property just east of mine since before I bought the place. We had a neighborly relationship in the truest Vermont sense of the word, which means we respected each other primarily by leaving each other alone. We waved from driveways. We'd had coffee exactly twice, both times because something practical required a conversation. She was not someone who showed up unannounced without a reason. I opened the door and looked at her face and knew right away there was one. She came in and sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug I poured for her and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to know I thought about coming over here for 3 days before I actually did it. I don't like getting into other people's business." I said, "But you're here." She said, "But I'm here," because she wanted me to lie, and I won't do that. Then she told me, about a week earlier, a young woman had come to her door. She introduced herself as Petra, daughter-in-law of the woman at the farmhouse down the road. She was pleasant and well-dressed, and she explained that she was worried about her mother-in-law. She said I'd been having a difficult time adjusting since retiring, that I'd been isolating myself, pushing family away, refusing help from people who genuinely cared about me. She said a neighbor's account of my behavior could be really valuable if things escalated to the point where the family needed to get involved in a more formal way. Ruth paused there and looked at her coffee. I said, "She wanted you to testify that I was mentally unwell." Ruth said, "That's what it sounded like to me, yeah." I sat with that for a moment. Petra hadn't just been planning to show up with a truck. She'd been building a case first, documentation, a neighbor willing to speak to my state of mind, a narrative that positioned her as the concerned daughter-in-law and me as the unstable woman who needed to be managed for her own good. It was methodical, it was deliberate, and it told me that whatever was coming next had been in the works for a lot longer than I'd realized. I asked Ruth what she'd said to her. Ruth set down her mug and looked at me straight and said, "I told her I'd never seen you looking better." Then I closed the door. She said it the way she said most things, flat and without decoration, like a fact being entered into a record. I nodded. I didn't trust myself to say much more than that right then. After Ruth left, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the light change over the fields. The sun was low and pale the way it gets in February in Vermont, more suggestion than warmth. The fields were still white. Nothing out there was moving. I thought about what Petra had done, the forged affidavit, the approach to Ruth, the careful, patient construction of in which she was reasonable and I was the problem. I'd seen that kind of thing before, not in my personal life, but in the hospital. Family members who decided they knew better than the patient, who started building consensus before anyone had asked them to, who showed up with folders and printouts and concerned expressions and a version of events that had been worked over until it was seamless. I knew what came after that kind of preparation. I went to the kitchen table and called Declan. Declan picked up on the first ring, which told me his assistant had flagged my name. I told him about Ruth's visit. I told him about the affidavit, the approach to a neighbor, the language Petra had used, the phrase a more formal way. I laid it out in the same order I used to use when briefing an incoming shift, chronological and specific, no editorializing. When I finished, Declan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Loretta, I want you to listen to me carefully." He said that what Petra had done with the affidavit was already on record. He said that attempting to establish a narrative about someone's mental state with with a third party, especially a neighbor, was a concerning escalation, and that in certain contexts, it could be the precursor to a guardianship filing, which is a legal proceeding in which someone petitions to take decision-making authority away from another person on the grounds that they're no longer capable of managing their own affairs. I said, "She's trying to build a case for control of the property." He said he couldn't say that for certain. But he said I needed to be prepared for the possibility that this wasn't going to stop on its own. He told me to document everything from this point forward: dates, times, conversations, any contact from Petra or her family, written records. He said if anything happened at the property, anything at all, I was to call law enforcement immediately and contact him right after. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote out everything that had happened since that first envelope arrived in January. Every conversation, every date, every silence that had lasted 4 seconds too long. I wrote in the same small, careful handwriting I'd used for patient charts for 35 years. When I finished, it was past 10 o'clock. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea I didn't really want, and I sat with it in the dark kitchen. And I thought about what it meant that my son's wife was building a legal case against me in the state of Vermont. Then I went to bed, because falling apart was not going to be useful to anyone, and certainly not to me. Wednesday evening, late February. My phone rang at 7 o'clock. Colt. His voice was different from the last time we'd spoken. Lower, the easy warmth he usually carried was still there underneath, but something was sitting on top of it, pressing it down. He said, "Mom, I need to be straight with you about something." I said, "Okay." He said Petra's father had booked a moving truck, Friday, 2 days from now. They were planning to come up to the farmhouse, all of them, Rudolph and Winifred, Sorsay and the kids, and they were planning to move in. I didn't say anything for a moment. I let that land. Then I asked him if he was telling me or asking me. He said, "I guess both." I said, "If you're asking, the answer is no. It was no 2 weeks ago, and it's no right now." "Why haven't you canceled the truck, Colt?" He said that Rudolph had booked it directly through his own account and that Colt wasn't on the reservation. He'd told Petra it was wrong, he said. They'd been fighting about it all week. But Rudolph had made the booking himself specifically so that Colt couldn't cancel it, and short of physically stopping a truck on a public road, there wasn't a whole lot he could do about it from Boston. I believed that part. Rudolph booking the truck himself was exactly the kind of move someone makes when they know the person closest to the situation is a weak point. It cut Colt out of the equation entirely and left him as a bystander to his own family's decisions, which I suspected was not entirely uncomfortable for him. I asked Colt if he had told Petra clearly and directly that I had said no. He said yes. I asked if Petra had indicated she would respect that. He was quiet. I said, Colt. He said, Mom, I'm sorry. I really am. I don't know how to fix this without everything falling apart. I said to him quietly, You can't be sorry and let it happen at the same time and call that sorry, Colt. That's not what that word means. He didn't respond to that. After a moment, he said he just wanted me to know so I wouldn't be caught off guard. I told him I appreciated that, and I meant it. Whatever else was true, he had called. He had warned me. That was something, and I held on to it. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a while. Then I picked up the legal pad and added Wednesday's date and wrote down everything he'd told me, word for word as best I could remember it. Then I called Declan and left a message telling him what was coming. Thursday morning, I drove into Woodstock and printed out the property deed at the library. I already had a copy at home, but I wanted a clean one, recent and clear, the kind that left no room for interpretation. I came back and called Declan's office and got him directly, and he confirmed what I already knew, that my ownership of the property was unambiguous, that no one had any legal right to enter without my permission, and that if anyone attempted to do so after being told to leave, that constituted trespass under Vermont law. He said again, document everything. Call law enforcement if they show up. Call me right after. I printed out a single page with the key information. Property owner, Loretta Ann Vance. Address, Declan's number, the non-emergency line for the Windsor County Sheriff's Office. I taped it to the refrigerator at eye level where I could read it from anywhere in the kitchen. Thursday night, I didn't watch television. I sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad and went through everything one more time, not because I needed to review it, but because it settled something in me to have it in order. 35 years of patient charts had taught me that the act of writing things down wasn't just record keeping. It was a way of telling yourself that what was happening was real, and that you were present for it, and that you were not going to pretend otherwise. I went to bed at 10 and slept better than I expected to. Friday, February 23rd, 2024. I was at the kitchen sink rinsing my coffee cup at 10:47 in the morning when I heard the gravel. I turned off the tap and stood still and listened. The specific sound of tires on gravel is something you learn when you live on a rural property, the way the sound changes depending on the size and speed of the vehicle. This was heavy, moving slow, deliberate. I looked out the window over the sink, white moving truck, pulling up the drive like it had been here before, like it knew the way. Behind it, a black SUV. I recognized it as Colt's. Behind that, a silver sedan I didn't know. Rudolph and Winifred, I assumed. I stood at the window and watched. My hands were dry from where I'd been rinsing the cup. I noticed that they were completely still. No tremor, no shake. That surprised me more than the truck did. Petra got out of the passenger side of the SUV before it had fully stopped. She was in a dark coat, hair pulled back, phone already in her hand. She walked around to the front of the truck, the way someone walks to the front of a room when they're about to run a meeting. She looked up at the house. She looked at the kitchen window. We looked at each other through the glass. She gave a small nod, not to me, to the men at the back of the truck. Come on, let's go. We're here. Let's get this moving. Like the house had already said yes. I turned from the window. I walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt. Then I walked to the back door and turned that one too. Then I picked up my phone and called the Windsor County Sheriff's Office non-emergency line. I gave them my name, my address, and a clear description of what was happening. I told them there was a group of people on my property attempting to move in without my consent. I told them I was inside, the doors were locked, and I was not in physical danger. I asked for a deputy to come out. The woman on the line said someone would be there within 20 minutes. She asked me to stay on the line if I felt unsafe. I told her I was fine and that I'd call back if anything changed. I hung up and sat down in the chair at the kitchen table. The knocking started about 30 seconds later. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Petra's voice still controlled, still reasonable on the surface. Mrs. Vance, we're here. Could you come to the door, please? I didn't answer. The knocking came again, louder this time. Then Rudolph's voice, rougher, carrying the particular frustration of a man who expected things to go a certain way and couldn't quite believe they weren't. Hey, we drove 4 hours. Come on now, open up. Then Cyrus's voice, higher, less certain than the others, saying something I couldn't quite make out. Then one of the kids started crying. The high, tired cry of a small child who doesn't understand what's happening and is picking up on the tension of the adults around them. That one was harder to sit with than the rest. I want to be honest about that. I sat in my chair and I heard that child crying on my front porch, and it cost me something to stay where I was. But I stayed. I looked at the piece of paper taped to the refrigerator. Property owner Loretta Ann Vance. I looked at Declan's number. I looked at the date I'd written on the legal pad. Colt did not knock. Through everything that followed, through all of it, I did not hear my son's voice at the door. Not once. I don't know if he stayed in the car, or if he stood on the porch and couldn't make himself knock, or if he walked around to the back of the property with his hands in his pockets staring at the fields. I only know he didn't knock, and in some ways that silence was the loudest thing that happened that day. The sheriff's deputies arrived in 14 minutes. I heard the patrol cars on the gravel, a different sound from the truck, lighter and faster. I heard the voices outside shift in register the way voices do when authority arrives. Petra's went up a little. Rudolph's went flat. One of the deputies knocked and identified himself, and I opened the door and showed him the deed and my ID and explained the situation in plain language. He looked at the documents, asked me a few straightforward questions, and then went back outside. I didn't watch from the window. I sat at the table and listened, Rudolph argued. I could hear the shape of it through the walls without making out all the words, the rising and falling of a man making a case he didn't have the paperwork to support. The deputy asked him something. Rudolph's voice went up. The deputy stayed level. At one point, I heard Petra say, "This is her son's family. You don't understand the full situation." And the deputy said, "Ma'am, what I need to understand right now is that this is the owner's property, and she hasn't given permission for entry. That's what matters here." 20 minutes after the deputies arrived, the truck engine started. I heard it back slowly down the gravel drive, the heavy sound of it retreating the way it had come. The other cars followed. I sat where I was for a while after the sound stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. The faucet dripped once on the cold side. Then I called Declan and left him a message telling him what had happened. That night, after I'd eaten dinner and washed the dishes and turned off most of the lights, my phone showed a message from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't open it, but something made me. It was from Rudolph Holt. It said, "I'm sorry about today. This wasn't how it should have gone. That was all. No explanation, no request for anything. Just that." I read it twice. I didn't write back, but I didn't delete it either. In 35 years of nursing, I'd learned that an apology offered quietly in private is sometimes the only kind a person is capable of. It doesn't make it enough, but it's not nothing either. In the ICU, you learn to take things for what they are rather than what you wish they were. And sometimes the best you can say about a day is that you got through it. That was enough for that night. The days after the truck came and went were quieter than I expected them to be, not peaceful. Quiet is different from peaceful. Peaceful is when the silence feels earned. Quiet is when you're waiting for the next thing and you don't know what shape it'll take or when it'll arrive. And so you just keep moving through your days and try not to hold your breath too, obviously. I moved through mine. Declan called Monday morning to walk me through what came next. Because Petra had submitted forged affidavit to state agencies, the process of fully reversing everything wasn't as simple as making a phone call. The county clerk's office needed to verify that my signature on the original document was fraudulent, which meant pulling records, cross-referencing, correspondence between Declan's office and two separate state agencies. He estimated 3 weeks, maybe a little more. 3 weeks in which technically the names Rudolph and Winifred Holt were still attached to my address in certain government databases. I asked Declan what that meant practically. He said it meant nothing actionable for me. The property deed was clear and unambiguous, and that was what mattered legally. But it meant that for 3 weeks I lived in the specific discomfort of knowing that something with a forged version of my name on it was still floating around in official records. And there was nothing to do about that, except wait for Declan's process to run its course. I made a decision early in that period that I was going to treat those 3 weeks the way I used to treat difficult stretches in the ICU. You don't fight the waiting. You can't. You find something to do with your hands, and you keep showing up, and you trust that the process will land where it's supposed to land. I started working on the back garden. The ground was still frozen in early March in Vermont, but there was preparation work to do, clearing out the dead growth from the fall, turning over what soil I could get into, figuring out what I wanted to plant when the thaw came. I was outside every morning by 8 o'clock. My knees complained about it. I ignored them. It helped. Then came the afternoon at Harlow's, which is the small grocery in Woodstock where I did most of my shopping. I was in the produce section looking at sweet potatoes when I noticed a woman I recognized from one of the town community meetings I'd attended the previous fall. We'd chatted for maybe 10 minutes at the refreshments table, nothing significant, just the normal neighborly exchange of opinions about local things. She looked up and saw me, and I saw the exact moment she recognized me. And then I watched her turn slightly, angling her body away, suddenly very focused on the carrots in front of her. She didn't say hello. She didn't catch my eye again. She moved on to the next aisle a minute later without looking back. I let her go. Some things aren't worth chasing. But I stood there with my sweet potatoes for a moment and understood what had happened. Whatever version of the story Petra had put into circulation, it had made it into town ahead of me. I was now a character in someone else's story. And in that story, I was not the person who had spent 35 years showing up for other people at their worst. I was the bitter woman who had locked her grandchildren out on the lawn. I put the sweet potatoes in my basket and finished my shopping and drove home. I didn't cry about it, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't sit in my chest in a particular way for the rest of that afternoon. That's the thing nobody tells you about being on the right side of something. Being right doesn't protect you from the story someone else is telling about you. Declan's confirmation came through at the end of March. Everything reversed, fully documented, affidavit flagged in the county records. I added the paperwork to the folder I'd started keeping, behind the property deed and in front of the notes from our various phone calls. Then I went outside and turned over another section of the back garden because the ground had finally thawed enough to work with, and I had tomatoes to get in the ground before May. Early April, a person I knew from the post office sent me a message that just said, "Loretta, there's something on Facebook you should probably see," and left a link. Petra had posted in one of the local Vermont community groups. She hadn't used my full name, but she'd given enough detail that anyone in the area who knew me would know exactly who she was talking about. The farmhouse, the town, the retired nurse, the 4 bedrooms. She'd described the day in February in terms that were carefully chosen. Her family had come to offer help to an elderly woman. Living alone, she wrote. They'd been met with locked doors and law enforcement. Her children had cried on the front lawn. Her father-in-law's mother had refused to even come to the window. I noticed the word elderly. I was 68 years old and had spent the previous 18 months physically renovating a 19th century farmhouse with my own hands. But sure, elderly, fine. The post had over 300 comments by the time I saw it. Most of them were sympathetic to Petra. A lot of that ain't right and poor thing. And some people just don't understand what family means anymore. A few people shared their own stories about difficult in-laws. One person called me a bitter old woman with no heart, which was a fairly ambitious conclusion to reach about someone you'd never met based on 4 paragraphs written by someone with a documented history of forging legal documents. But social media has never been particularly interested in that kind of nuance. I read through most of it, not because I enjoyed it, because I needed to understand what I was dealing with. And then, somewhere around comment 80 or 90, I found it. The account was called Nurse VT Retired. The profile photo was a plain blue square. The comment was not long. It said, "I worked alongside Loretta Vance for 12 years at Mercy General Hospital in Burlington. I watched her sit with patients who were dying at 3 in the morning when no one else would stay. I watched her come in on her days off to check on people she was worried about. I watched her hold families together in the worst moments of their lives without ever asking for anything back. If she said no to something, she had a reason, and that reason is hers. It doesn't need to be explained or justified to anyone on the internet. That was all. It didn't go viral. It didn't get thousands of likes. But underneath it, over the next day or so, something happened that I hadn't expected. Other accounts started replying. Nurses, nursing assistants, a respiratory therapist I actually recognized by name from a different unit at Mercy General, a woman who said she'd been a patient there in 2014, and that a nurse named Loretta had stayed with her through a procedure she'd been terrified of and had held her hand the whole time. 31 replies in total. Small, quiet, specific. I read every one of them. I want to tell you what that felt like because I think it matters. It didn't feel like winning. It didn't feel like vindication exactly. It felt more like being recognized. Like someone had turned on a light in a room I'd been sitting in the dark in and said, "Oh, there you are. We see you." I hadn't realized how much I needed that until it happened. And sitting there at my kitchen table reading those replies, I had a thought I hadn't expected to have. The thought was that this house had space in it, not just physical space, the kind of space that the right person, some coming in the right way, could actually rest in. And I had been so focused on protecting it from the wrong people that I hadn't thought much about what it might mean to open it to the right ones. I called Declan the next day, not about legal matters time, just to ask him a practical question about short-term rental regulations in Windsor County. He walked me through what I needed to know. By the first week of May, I had a listing. I kept it simple. Quiet farmhouse outside Woodstock, Vermont, maximum 2 adults. No children, no pets, no parties. Minimum 2 nights, maximum 5. This is a space for rest. If you are not looking for rest, please do not book. First guest was a woman named Odalis Marsh, 44, a photographer from Portland, Maine. She messaged me ahead of time to ask about the morning light and whether she could bring her own French press. I told her the light came through the east-facing windows in the kitchen around 6:30 and that she was welcome to bring whatever she needed. She stayed 3 nights, woke up before I did every morning, was gone by 8 with her camera bag over her shoulder, and came back each evening quiet and unhurried. When she left, she put a small printed photograph on the kitchen table, a shot of the farmhouse taken from the road, at frost still on the grass, the windows lit from inside. She'd written on the back, "Thank you for the quiet." I put it on the windowsill above the sink. The second booking was a couple from New Hampshire. They had confirmed it was just the 2 of them. They arrived with 4 people. I was at the door before they reached the porch steps. I said, "My listing says maximum 2 adults." The woman smiled the smile of someone who has gotten away with this kind of thing before and said, "Oh, they're just friends. They won't be any trouble. They're super low key." I said, "I'll refund 50% of your booking fee because you've made the drive. But I can't accommodate 4 people when I agreed to 2. The man started to say something about how it was just 1 extra room and it wasn't a big deal. I looked at him the way I used to look at family members in the hospital who had decided that the rules applied to everyone except them. It's a particular look. It doesn't involve raised voices or dramatic pauses. It's just very still and very clear, and it tends to communicate that the conversation is over. He stopped talking. They left. I processed the partial refund. I ate dinner alone that evening and felt entirely fine about how it had gone. I thought about it later, washing the dishes. A few months ago, I might have let it go, might have told myself it wasn't worth the conflict. That version of me had been letting things go for a long time. She had been so practiced at flexibility that she'd forgotten what it felt like to just stand still. I was done being flexible about things that mattered. June came in warm and fast, the way Vermont Junes sometimes do after a long winter, like the season is making up for lost time. The fields behind the house went green almost overnight. I had tomatoes in the ground, a small herb bed along the south wall that I had absolutely no confidence in, but was cautiously optimistic about, and a back porch that I'd finally gotten around to fixing the loose board on. I was sitting on that porch one evening when my phone buzzed with a notification. A neighbor 2 roads over had forwarded me a screenshot with a short note that just said, "Thought you should know." Petra had posted again, this time not in the community group, on her own personal profile with my full name. She wrote that I was now renting my property to strangers for profit while refusing to help my own family. She wrote that the house would one day belong to her husband, and that she felt it was important for people to know how I was choosing to use it in the meantime. She wrote that they were looking into their legal options. Their legal options. I read it twice. Then I forwarded the screenshot to Declan with a single line that said, "I think you need to see this." He called me the next morning. He said that the post contained several statements that were materially false or misleading, that characterizing the property as something her husband would one day own while I was alive and in full possession of my faculties and had made no such arrangement in any legal document was the kind of statement that could constitute defamation. That using my full name in conjunction with those statements in a public forum increased the exposure significantly. He said he wanted to send a cease and desist letter. I said, "Send it." The letter went out within 48 hours. It was formal and specific and laid out precisely which statements were false, what the actual legal status of the property was, and what further action could follow if the post remained live or if similar statements were made in the future. 48 hours after that, the post was gone. Not because the comments turned against her, not because the community rallied to my defense, because there were legal consequences attached to the word she had chosen. And when those consequences became concrete and specific and signed by an attorney, the post disappeared. That's how it actually works, I thought, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee the morning after it came down. Not the way it works in the stories people tell about the internet, where the right comment goes viral and the truth wins by popular vote. What works is paperwork. What works is documentation. What works is having someone like Declan who picks up his own phone and knows which words carry legal weight. I thought about all the years I'd spent in the hospital watching families navigate impossible situations. The ones who did it best were never the loudest ones. They were the ones who asked the right questions, kept records of the answers, and understood that the system, whatever its flaws, responded to specificity. I had been specific. It had worked. I went outside and checked on the tomatoes. They were doing fine. July came the way July comes to Vermont when you've had a hard spring, which to say it arrived like it had something to prove. The fields behind the farmhouse went gold at the edges in the afternoons. The mornings were cool enough to sit outside with a sweater on and warm enough by 10 o'clock that you didn't need it anymore. I started leaving the kitchen window open after breakfast and letting whatever was outside come in. The smell of grass and something sweet from the wildflowers that had come up along the stone wall at the property's edge, without any encouragement from me. The tomatoes I'd planted in late May with low expectations had responded to my pessimism by thriving aggressively. By July, I had more than I knew what to do with and had begun leaving paper bags of them on Ruth's porch every few days, which she acknowledged with a note in the mailbox that said simply, "Thank you, too many, keep going." That made me laugh out loud alone in my kitchen, which is one of the better feelings there is. Ruth and I had settled into a rhythm that neither of us had planned, and neither of us commented on directly, because that's not how either of us operated. She came over on Thursday evenings. I made dinner. We ate and talked, or ate and didn't talk, depending on what the evening called for. She told me things about her husband Garrett, who had been gone 9 years, not sad things necessarily, just things. The way he'd taken his coffee, a trip they'd taken to Nova Scotia in 1987 that she still thought about sometimes. The way he'd laughed at his own jokes before he got to the punchline. I told her things about Warren. It wasn't grief exactly. It was more like maintenance, keeping the memory of a person aired out so it doesn't go stale in a closed room. The guests came and went in a way that had begun to feel almost like a natural rhythm of the house itself. A writer from Philadelphia who was working on something he declined to describe, which I respected, who sat at the desk in the guest room from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening and emerged for meals with the slightly dazed look of someone returning from a long distance. a retired couple from Ohio who went walking every morning on the trail behind the property and came back with their cheeks pink and their voices easy with each other, in the way of people who have been together long enough that they don't need to perform it for anyone. A woman of about 58 who arrived alone on a Tuesday with a single bag and stayed 2 nights and said almost nothing, and left a small embroidered handkerchief folded on the pillow, white cotton with pale blue flowers along the edge, stitched by hand. I kept that one on the kitchen windowsill next to Odalise's photograph. I thought sometimes about what these people were coming here for and what they found when they got here. They weren't coming for the farmhouse specifically. They were coming for whatever the listing had communicated to them about what kind of space this was. And what I had put in that listing, I realized, was not really a description of a house at all. It was a description of a set of conditions I had spent 68 years trying to create for myself and had only recently managed to. Quiet, intentional, no performance required. People were hungry for that. I was a little surprised by how hungry. Colt called on a Thursday evening in the middle of August. I was on the porch with my after-dinner tea when the phone buzzed, and I looked at the screen for a moment before I answered, because I wanted to make sure I was ready. I was. "Hey, Mom," he said, same as always, soft. "Hey," I said. He didn't do the thing he sometimes did where he asked how I was and we spent 5 minutes in the shallow water of fine and good and keeping busy. He went straight to it. He said, "Mom, I've been trying to figure out how to have this conversation for months, and I haven't figured it out, so I'm just going to say it without having figured it out." I said, "Okay." He said I was wrong. Not just about February, about all of it. About not telling you what was happening with Petra's family when I knew. About not being louder when it mattered. About letting you find out about the truck from me 2 days before, instead of stopping it from happening at all. I was trying not to lose anybody, and what I actually did was make choices by not making them, and that's still choosing. You told me that and you were right. I didn't say anything for a moment. The evening was very still. A moth was doing something near the porch light. I said, "You called me the night before." He said, "I know." I said, "That mattered, Colt. I want you to know that. It didn't change what happened, but it mattered that you called." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about the way I grew up watching you just handle everything. Handle Dad dying and handle the bills and handle me and handle all of it and never fall apart. And I think I spent a long time believing that meant you didn't need anything, that you were just built different from other people, that needing things wasn't part of how you were made." I said, "Everyone needs things." He said, "I know that now. I think I always knew it. I just found it easier not to act like I did." I asked him the thing I actually wanted to know. Not how are things, not is everything okay, not the polite version. I asked him directly, "Are you okay?" Just him, not the situation, not him and Petra, just him. He was quiet long enough that I counted to 6 before he answered. He said, "Not entirely, no." I said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in a long time." He made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. We talked for another 20 minutes or so. We didn't resolve anything. There were no agreements made, no plans for visits, no tidy conclusions drawn. But we talked like two people who were being straight with each other about what was actually true. And that was more than we'd managed in a long time, maybe more than we'd managed in years if I was being honest with myself. After we hung up, I sat on the porch until it got too dark to see the fields, and then I went inside and washed my cup and went to bed. I didn't know what came next for us, but I knew that call was real, and real was somewhere to start. September moved through quickly the way it does when you're busy with your hands. I put up tomatoes. I cleared the herb bed, which had produced a genuinely impressive amount of basil and absolutely nothing else, which I chose to interpret as a partial success. The guest room turned over a few more times. Each person left it clean, and each person left something small behind, not by accident, but intentionally, the way you leave something at a place you want to remember. A postcard tucked under the lamp, a small bar of handmade soap, lavender, and oat left on the bathroom shelf, a folded piece of paper with a poem on it that I read once and then left on the nightstand for the next person. I stopped wondering what it meant and started just accepting that this was what the house had become. A place people passed through carefully, a place that held things without asking too much in return. Then October came and the leaves turned, and one morning I walked out to the mailbox in my boots with the ground hard under them and found a white envelope with no stamp. Colt's handwriting. I stood at the end of the drive for a moment with it in my hands. The trees along the road were red and orange, and the air smelled like cold and something burning pleasantly far off. Someone's wood stove starting up for the season. I brought the envelope inside, set it on the kitchen table, put the kettle on, made my coffee slowly and deliberately, sat down, looked at it. Then I opened it. It wasn't a letter in the way I'd been half expecting, organized and revised, the kind of thing you write when you've decided what you want to say. It was 2 pages of his handwriting, small and slightly uneven the way it always was. The same handwriting I'd watched develop from the oversized, uncertain print of a 7-year-old into this, and it was clearly written in one sitting without stopping to reread. The date at the top was February 23rd, the night of the truck. He'd written it that night and kept it for 8 months without sending it. I read it straight through without stopping. I won't tell you what it said. It wasn't mine to share before, and it isn't now. But I'll tell you this, it was true. Whatever else it was true. And that's rarer than people think. When I finished, I folded it carefully along the original creases and held it for a moment. Then I got up and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the back garden, at the bare tomato stakes still standing in the turned earth, at the stone wall with the dead wildflowers against it, at the gray sky coming in low over the fields. I stood there for a while. Then I came back to the table. I opened the drawer on the right side, the one where I kept things I didn't have a category for yet. A button from a coat I no longer owned, a birthday card from a colleague who'd retired before me, the spare key to a car I'd sold 4 years ago. I put the envelope in. I closed the drawer. Not thrown away, not framed, not answered, just held. I thought about what I used to tell families in the ICU when they asked me how long recovery would take, and I didn't have a number for them. I used to say that healing doesn't run on a clock. It runs on readiness, and readiness isn't something you can schedule. It comes when it comes, and your job in the meantime is just to keep the door from closing all the way. I wasn't ready. That was the truth of it, plain and without drama, but the drawer wasn't locked. November. First snow of the season early, just a dusting that came overnight and turned the fields white and made everything look briefly like a fresh start. I found a piece of pine in the shed, left over from the porch repair, smooth-grained and just the right size. I sanded it down in the garage over 2 evenings, slow, careful passes, the kind of work that requires enough attention to keep your mind from wandering, but not so much that you can't think at all. I painted it gray, let it dry. Painted the letters by hand in white, smaller than I'd planned, which I think made it better. Private residence, guest invitation only. I nailed it to the post beside the front door on a Wednesday morning with the temperature in the 20s and my breath making small clouds in front of me. Stepped back, looked at it. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a declaration of war or a response to anything that had happened. It was just a true statement about what this place was and who got to decide who came into it. That same week, Ruth came for Thursday dinner, and I made butternut squash soup and cornbread, and we sat at the kitchen table until past 9, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. She told me about the first winter she and her husband had spent in this part of Vermont, how they'd been completely unprepared for it, how the pipes had frozen twice and they'd eaten soup for 3 weeks straight because neither of them could figure out the wood stove. I told her about the first winter I'd worked nights in the ICU, how I'd driven home in the dark every morning. For months, the sun come up from my car in the hospital parking lot because I was too tired to drive and too awake to sleep. We sat with that for a while. 2 women on the other side of the hard parts in a warm kitchen with soup. The listing stayed open through November. One guest, a man in his 60s traveling alone from Connecticut, asked in his booking message if it was all right if he brought his dog. I said no, the listing says no pets. He wrote back right away and said, of course. I should have read more carefully. Is there anything in the area I can point you toward for him? The thoughtfulness of that, the simple basic thoughtfulness, made me think about all the ways people surprised you if you gave them the chance. He stayed 4 nights. He was quiet and courteous and left the room exactly as he'd found it, which is honestly all I've ever asked of anyone. One evening near the end of November, I sat at the kitchen table with my tea and didn't turn on the television and didn't check my phone and just sat in the quiet of the house. The radiators ticked. The wind came around the north corner of the building the way it did when the temperature dropped past a certain point. The lamp over the table made a warm circle, and everything beyond it was soft and dark. The envelope was in the drawer. The sign was on the post. The tomato stakes were still standing in the frozen garden, waiting for every material. I sat there for a long time, and I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. That was new. That was the thing that was new. I spent 35 years taking care of people in their worst moments. I learned that fear makes people do things they never thought they could. I don't excuse what happened, but I understand what it's like when it wears the clothes of entitlement. What kept me up at night wasn't the moving truck or the posts online. It was Colt's voice saying, "I don't know what to do." I've heard that voice before, in hospital hallways at 2 a.m. People who aren't bad, just holding too much and too afraid to put any of it down. But here's what I know now. You don't owe anyone your peace in exchange for their convenience. Boundaries aren't walls, they're doors, and you decide who gets a key. The envelope is still in the drawer. I'm not ready. And for the first time in my life, not being ready feels okay. Some mornings, that's enough.